I'm not saying that if Zohran Mamdani is elected and Fateh is elected in their elections that the country's over in that case, because that is probably going to happen. We still have a chance as a country, but if we just submit finally to this invasion, then the country is over. You could fill a very large museum with exhibits about empires that collapsed because as barbarians gathered outside the gates, their leaders were distracted by relatively unimportant internal conflicts. And certainly you could set up rows and rows of bookshelves at the Louvre with volume after volume going into detail about how various civilizations, from the Byzantines to the Ottomans to the Canadians, met their demise because they were unable or unwilling to address the very real looming threats they were facing from the outside. And then, of course, once you meticulously assembled all these books documenting these historical examples and placed them in the Louvre, those books would probably be stolen by a handful of burglars armed with power tools. So put another way, it's the highest luxury for wealthy and prosperous civilizations to fight amongst themselves right up until the moment they realize that in reality, the barbarians aren't simply at the gates anymore. They've made their way inside. And no one's even noticed. And by that point, it's too late. The foreign conquest is plain for everyone to see right at the moment when you can't do anything about it. So if you don't see where I'm going with this, then that's probably a good sign, if I'm being honest. There's no reason to recap any of the infighting that's occurring right now among the conservative movement. If you're not aware of the extraordinary degree of internal squabbling on the right, which I suspect that most average conservatives probably aren't, well, that's a point in your favor anyway. It's an indication that you don't spend much of your time online paying attention to the endless bickering on social media. But suffice it to say, many conservatives are at each other's throats at the moment. They're certainly at my throat from every angle, even though none of them can really explain what it is I've done or said that they find so objectionable. I also haven't changed my goal, which is advancing the interests of this country and of the Americans who live here. That's all I've ever tried to do or ever really talked about. But here's the important thing. No matter where you stand on these attacks and all this drama, if you're even aware of it, really doesn't matter. What matters is that while conservatives are busy ripping each other to shreds, an Islamic socialist from Uganda is about to take over the biggest city in the country. And at the same time, as if that's not enough, a far-left Somali scam artist is about to take over one of the biggest cities in America's heartland, Minneapolis. And this is the kind of threat that a serious country and a serious political movement would prioritize above any other. If foreigners who want to destroy the U.S. are able to seize control of our largest cities, then nothing else matters, okay? Whatever it is that you're worried about doesn't matter. Foreign policy doesn't matter. Podcasts, even the most offensive and racist podcasts you can think of, don't matter. The Constitution doesn't matter. The Heritage Foundation doesn't matter. Nothing matters at all in that scenario, because we will have ceased to exist as a country. Okay, once we become Somalia or Uganda, we've lost everything, and we can never get it back. Now, no one needs me to outline the case against Omar Fateh, who's probably going to be the next mayor of Minneapolis. No one needs me to outline the case against Zohran Mamdani, who's probably going to be the next mayor of New York. Nor does anyone, at least in this audience, need me to make the case against mass migration more broadly or Somali immigration in particular or anything like that. We've beaten that drum many, many times before, and we'll continue to beat it. But really, especially if you live in places like New York or Minneapolis or any of the thousands of American suburbs that have become unrecognizable in the past 20 years, you don't really need to watch any monologue about it, listen to any podcast about it. You've already seen firsthand exactly what the problem is and how it's about to get much, much worse unless we actually take some meaningful action. Because again, if we don't, the country's over. And I'm not saying that if Zohran Mamdani is elected and Fateh is elected, in their elections, that the country's over in that case, because that is probably going to happen. And we still have a chance as a country. But if we just submit finally to this invasion, then the country is over. It's just done. We don't have a country anymore. If the country comes to reflect the vision of somebody like Zohran Mamdani, then that's the end of the country, because that's what he wants. That's his vision. Now, the good news, although it's easy to forget it, is that meaningful action is indeed possible. The Republican Party currently has control of both houses of Congress in addition to the White House. In case you forgot, conservatives have the power to prevent any more American cities from being taken over by foreign communists. So in the interest of being constructive, instead of, simply identifying the problem that we've all identified by now, or those of us who are sane and have common sense have identified, I just wanted to outline a few proposals, right, which the Republican Congress could and should pass into law immediately. So here are some actual practical solutions that we could talk about. And not just talk about, but that could be pursued. We have the power right now to do it. But before I do so, I need to preempt the objections that are going to sound something like this. People will say, well, the courts might strike that down, or, well, the Democrats would filibuster. Yeah, it's true that courts might strike down these proposals, just like they've struck down every single policy the Trump administration has attempted to implement. And yeah, Democrats might filibuster the legislation, but that doesn't mean that we're out of options. We can eliminate the filibuster. We can appeal rulings by lower court judges, and if necessary, we can ignore them if it comes down to it. But I don't think that will be necessary, though, because the proposals I'm about to outline are indeed both constitutional and obviously necessary. And for my first proposal, by way of background, take a look at these recent appearances by Omar Fateh, the scam artist running for mayor of Minneapolis, who's become known as the Mamdani of the Midwest. Watch.
Have a better communication between the mayor and the chief, and also the city council members, so that whenever we know something's coming down the pike, that city council is alerted immediately, because they're the connection point to community, and they can articulate that and disseminate that information to folks. I think that's really important. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Somalia. Somalia. Hiran State. Ma'awisle. Ma'awisle. Early voting was hadda illa November 4. I need your vote. I need you.
So he's waving the Somali flag. He's speaking in a foreign language. He's pledging fealty to Somalia. He's talking about tipping off illegals in advance of ICE raids. He clearly understands that his constituency is Somalis like himself, not Americans. And he's not ashamed of any of this because, as we've discussed before, Somalis are now a dominant voting bloc in Minneapolis, which is home to the largest Somali population in the entire country. The solution, or one of them, one thing that we could do is ban politicians and candidates from holding rallies or creating advertisements in any language but English. American voters should always know what their leaders are saying. This is basic. Ask, any voter who can't speak English, any voter who needs a candidate or a politician to speak in another language, shouldn't be a voter, should not be voting in the first place. Now, right away, I can imagine the replies, that violates the First Amendment. Well, actually, it doesn't. It's not a restriction on the content of anyone's speech. Politicians can have whatever ideas they want. It's a restriction on how that speech is delivered. And we have many restrictions like that. That's why politicians can't campaign within 50 feet of a polling place. That's why politicians can't blast their campaign advertisements at 2 a.m. with a bullhorn outside of your house. There's a lot of different ways that they cannot convey their message. So the principle is pretty clear. Speech becomes unlawful when and only when the government has a clear and unambiguous need to regulate that speech in order for the country and its government to remain functional. And in the context of laws that require candidates to speak English, there's precedent to back this up. Consider the case of Alejandrina Cabrera, which you probably haven't heard of this, but a little over a decade ago, she ran for city council in Arizona. But there was a problem with her candidacy. The law in Arizona requires that elected officials have the capacity to speak decent English. So this is from Time magazine. Quote, the Arizona Supreme Court ruled last week that Cabrera did not meet the state's requirement that elected officials must be proficient in English. Cabrera's candidacy became an issue when the mayor, a political rival of hers, filed a lawsuit claiming that her lack of English proficiency made her ineligible. Cabrera, an American citizen who spent some of her childhood in Mexico, knows some English When she was questioned at trial, she was able to state her name and place of birth, but she could not answer a question about which high school she attended. In much of the country, Cabrera would not have a problem. Candidates do not have to prove that they know English, but Arizona enacted a law in 2006 that bars people who do not speak, write, and read English from holding state or local offices. Now, here's more coverage from the New York Times. Quote, when Cabrera speaks English, her face takes on an expression somewhere between deep discomfort and outright despair. Her tongue, which darts around in her mouth in her native Spanish, slows to a crawl. In his report, which was detailed in a court hearing on Wednesday, William Eggington, a professor of English and linguistics at Brigham Young University in Utah, said that based on interviews and tests he conducted with Ms. Cabrera, she had basic survival level English that fell well below that needed to participate in city business. This is the law, the city attorney said, arguing that the 1910 Act granting Arizona statehood required office holders to perform their duties in English without the aid of a translator. It's been on the books since statehood. So she was tossed from the ballot, and that was it. I mean, it's as simple as that. If the state of Arizona can have a law like this, then the federal government can and should impose a similar restriction on every candidate in every office. Since COVID, millions of Americans have started taking emergency preparedness seriously, especially when it comes to food storage. And that's smart. But here's the problem most people overlook. All that emergency food doesn't do you much good if you can't actually cook it when the power's out. That's why My Patriot Supply put together their Black Friday Survival Special. You get a 4-week emergency food supply plus over $150 in essential gear, everything you actually need to prepare those meals. We're talking about a portable cook stove, fuel tablets, fire starters, a water purifier, a bug-out bag, and more. It's basically a complete survival kit in one package, perfect for natural disasters, civil unrest, or worse. And honestly, it makes a pretty practical Christmas gift too. But it's only available through Black Friday, so head to mypatriotsupply.com/Walsh to check out everything that's included. With all the uncertainty in the world right now, we simply can't afford to be unprepared. So go to mypatriotsupply.com/Walsh and get prepared today. That's mypatriotsupply.com/Walsh. Now, we can require that candidates speak coherent English instead of a foreign language when they're campaigning. And there's no First Amendment violation here. If anything, the First Amendment and the Constitution requires we have a law like this. The country cannot exist for much longer without it. And while we're at it, we should require an English language proficiency test for voters when they register to vote. And again, the principle is the same. If you can't speak English, then you shouldn't be voting. You're not really an American. You're not capable of interacting with other Americans in this country. You haven't made the slightest effort to assimilate into our country. And if you're allowed to vote, what does that mean? Well, it means you'll protect your own country's interests, not America's. And for that reason, there is a clear and compelling government interest in preventing you from voting, just like we prevent felons from voting. Yes, in this country, it's entirely possible for an American citizen to lose his right to vote by becoming a felon. And many states have laws like that on the books. But ask yourself this question: who's more dangerous in the voting booth? A Somali communist who can't speak a word of English, who wants to drain every dollar from the U.S. Treasury and send it back to Somalia, or a guy who hasn't paid his taxes in 5 years? Who's more dangerous in the voting booth? A Muslim socialist from Uganda who can't speak English and who wants to dismantle the police force, or a guy who committed insurance fraud 5 years ago? Now, we all know the answers to these questions. If we're going to ban felons from voting, then we should ban foreign language speakers from voting too, if they can't speak English, if they're not proficient in English. We should also require all politicians and candidates to renounce any dual citizenships they may hold and publicly pledge their total and absolute loyalty to the U.S., to the absolute exclusion of all other nations. Now, from a First Amendment standpoint, this should not be controversial either. As to the latter part, we already make elected officials take an oath of office, of course. Many public servants in various fields have the same obligation. That's because the Constitution explicitly states that office holders shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. So all I'm proposing is that we move the oath forward a bit to the candidate stage. Like, you should not be able to run for office in this country unless you're willing to swear total, absolute fealty to this country to the exclusion of every other country. And if you're not willing to do that, then you should not be allowed to run for office in the first place. Now, yeah, a candidate can lie, but at least this country would be spared the indignity of watching Somali politicians telling us to our faces for months on end that they don't actually care about representing Americans. You know, they'd have to pretend to care about this country. And for some of them, particularly the inbred ones, that might be too difficult to fake. And some of them would be unwilling to do it. Would Omar Fateh be willing in the candidate phase? Would he be willing to get up there? Would he have been willing to get up there as a prerequisite to run for office? Would he have been willing to stand up and say, I swear my absolute loyalty to this country. I put this country above every other country, including Somalia? Would he have even been willing to say that? Probably not. And additionally, as to the second proposal I just made, dual citizens are already subjected to dramatically increased scrutiny when they're trying to obtain, say, a top secret security clearance. So there's no reason that we shouldn't impose even more scrutiny when a dual citizen tries to run for office, given the obvious conflict of interest that's involved. Again, there is precedent. You know, we don't even need to make an argument. We just need to pass a law immediately. And here's one more idea while I'm at it. That would clear up a lot of these problems and would also make it so that someone like Mamdani or Fateh would never be able to be elected ever again. So here's just an idea. If over 10% of immigrants from a certain country are on welfare in this country, then we should ban all immigration from that country for the next 10 years. Okay, there's a reasonable policy. And, 10 and 10 is kind of arbitrary. You could set the threshold anywhere. 5%, 20%, doesn't matter. But you could set it at 0.01%. I mean, that's where I'd prefer to put it. But I'm being kind of generous in where I set the bar, being very reasonable. But the point is that if a significant number of immigrants from a country are coming here to leech off of our people rather than to contribute to this nation and its people, then we need to shut off the spigot. And this should be the safest proposal of all the ones I've laid out. Foreigners don't have any right to enter this country in the first place. It's a privilege. And we should obviously shut it down immediately if it's turning into a burden for American taxpayers. Last week we talked about how well over 50% of illegal aliens receive food stamps, many of them from countries like Somalia, Haiti, Iraq. So terminate all migration from these countries immediately for at least 10 years. And again, you could say 50 years, 100 years. I mean, I'd be in favor of that, but I'm being very generous. 10 years. Shut it off for 10 years. We'll save a lot of money, be much better for this country. And we won't have Haitians, winning the mayor's race in Ohio anytime soon. So it's a win-win. Now, if you want to quibble with some of these proposals, that's fine. Maybe you think some of them won't work. These are just kind of a few ideas off the top of my head. The point is, this is the kind of thing that we should be talking about every single day. This is what drives me nuts, is that we have power right now, and we're not spending every single moment of every day talking about real things we can do to use that power to solve some of these problems, the big problems. How is that not the focal point every single day? We're not going to have this power forever. This is a short window that we have right now, and it is closing. And these are the kinds of proposals that conservatives, whether they're posting on social media or hosting a podcast or working at a think tank or anywhere else, should be spending their time on. These are proposals that advance conservatism and more importantly, preserve the future of this country. It's what we elected conservatives to do. So why aren't they doing it? Why isn't... I've thrown the idea. I'm not the first person to have an idea like this. Call it the 10 and 10 law or whatever. 10% on welfare, 10-year ban. Could someone explain what the downside would be to that? What would be the downside? How would it hurt America? Can anyone say, whoa, 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 whoa? We can't do that. That's really going to hurt us. Can anyone make that case? I'd love to hear it. But nobody can. No one would be able to explain what the problem would be. And any attempt to explain the problem would focus on how it would negatively impact the third world country where these people are coming from. But that is not our concern, is it? Or it shouldn't be. So, Republicans, the ball's in your court. Someone pick it up. Propose the law. You can even take credit for it. Go ahead. I don't care. I just want to get it done. Why aren't we getting it done? Until anyone can explain that, it's our responsibility to demand that Republicans answer this simple and fundamental question. What are you doing to ensure that some of the most important cities in this country are actually run by Americans instead of foreign subversives like Zohran Mamdani and Omar Fateh? That's the question that matters. And before another conservative fires another volley at anyone else on the right, before another major American city falls, someone in power needs to answer it, while our side still has power to wield. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.